Okay, and welcome everyone to this open session of the Mission Atlantic General Assembly for 2021. Thank you all for joining. If I get the panelists to start sharing their video.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, so for those of us who have joined from outside, we are doing one single session of our General Assembly open for the public, and that's this one here. And the structure of this session will be that after a quick introduction from me, we'll have Saskia Otto presenting a science talk on qualitative vulnerability assessments that has been undertaken within the project. And subsequently, we'll have a quick introduction to the rest of the panelists, for including presentations from each of them on the case studies that they are representing here in Mission Atlantic. After a quick introduction to all the case studies, we're going to open up the panel to questions, and you can post those as meeting attendees into the Q&A box as part of the webinar, and you can also raise your hands. We will be having the panelists answer questions as they pop up in the chat, but we'll also be asking you if you would like to ask your question in person, and we'll promote you up to turn on your video and your microphone and have a discussion with our panelists. And so to get things kicked off, I'm going to ask Saskia Otto to share her screen and give us a presentation on human activities to ecosystem services in Mission Atlantic's regional system mapping.
Okay, thanks, Elliot. I was trying to share my screen, but it says that somebody else is sharing it, so I can't. Now to work. Okay. Here we go. I'm gonna make this smaller. Okay, so welcome everyone to the open session today, or the panel discussion later on. And what I will do to give you a basis for the discussion is I will present a little bit what we did in the deliverables 7.1 report. I mean, most of the case study leaders have already, I guess, glanced through it. And I mean, it's not only a report that was written by one or two people, but it was kind of a collective effort. And we also seen some more advance, or some more progress yesterday by Dave. And so some of that might be a little bit old now, but still I'm going to tell you a little bit what we did in that report. So once more, what we are going to do in work package 7. You heard that we wanted to start with a qualitative assessment, and that is really now only linked to work package 1, to the linkages that you establish between the system components that you defined within that ODIM framework. And the initial idea was in that report, in the first task, to really look at just the presence absence data, and that maybe identify clusters of pressure impact chains across case studies, identify whether there are regional vulnerability hotspots, and also reveal knowledge or data gaps. In the next step, when we do the semi-quantitative assessment, and I will talk a little bit also on that, is that we want to work more on the indicator and try to do a risk assessment on a more semi-quantitative level, but really on the indicator, not necessarily the components that you defined in the conceptual ODIM model. And so what we also want to check then whether there are any kind of critical dependencies and functional redundancies using topological network indices. However, I started already to try to do this also with the presence absence data in the deliverable report. I will also show you. And afterwards, then comes a quantitative assessment where we will also build some network models like a Bayesian belief network, run simulations under different scenarios, and then also compare the model output with the work package 6 output and kind of produce an ensemble scenario that can be expected, and also looking for the magnitude of indicator responses across all those models. So To revise a little bit the methodology of risk assessments in marine ecology, I had a master's student who's now also a PhD student within the Mission Atlantic program. And she was looking into, she did a literature review also on risk assessments and developed a modular framework. And I'm also going to talk quickly about that at the end. So in green, you see kind of mainly literature that is related to contaminants and sediments. And these are actually the first literature or papers on risk assessment. So this is where it comes from. And they have also their own methodology. In blue are more papers on risk assessment related to invasive species, and also applying different type of models. And what we are mostly looking at are the kind of literature in blue and in yellow and in purple. The yellow one is more related to marine spatial planning, ecosystem-based management, monitoring, and that is kind of also covering methods that are similar to the ODIM approach, or kind of also covering the ODIM approach. There's also then the vulnerability assessments that you heard of a lot, mostly in relation to climate change and often then done on fish species. And so the different directions in marine ecology also have developed their own techniques. So when it comes to qualitative network models, usually we build a conceptual model based on literature and expert knowledge, and then try some hierarchical scoring, where we also have an impact matrix and an object matrix, and then put them together to get a rank of pressure and natural drivers in some weighted object matrix. And so this is often done also within that marine ecosystem management framework, not based on indicators per se, and also not calculating any type of vulnerability. That is more done in relation to climate. So what is looked at is the exposure of the pressure, often climate related. So the exposure and the severity or the magnitude, spatial extent and everything that can also come from model output of the climate models, and also some expert knowledge, and then sensitivity of the individual fish species is done based on literature, and then always towards that particular climate-related pressure. Some methods also, or approaches also include adaptive capacity, but not all of them. And so in that first report, we just wanted to look at the, apply the qualitative approach, look only at your binary data. And the aim was first to develop the individual binary networks, but I mean, it's also something that you did anyway for yourself and within work package 1, to also do a cross-regional network that is weighted by the linkages that are occurring across all case studies. And then also do some exploration of common or highly linked sectors, pressures and ecological characteristics, to also then identify whether there are any kind of key linkage change. Can we say that fishing is mainly related to pelagic fish, and that is related then to one single ecosystem service? So on top of that, I also calculated some network indices to explore the connectivity within the network, and also estimate the complexity of the network and see whether it's different between case studies or not. So the network indices I used were not the typical ones that you see in food web models, because it's a different type of model we have. There's no internal feedback loop that you can also add, and it's very hierarchical, and it has those 4 different levels. So it's not a tripartite, I don't know how it's called, we have 4 levels, quadrated, I don't know. So I use the ones that are often used in transportation network theory, where you have unidirectional networks. And so that is the number of components, the total length, so the total number of links between the nodes or components. Then the ratio between both, which is called the beta index, and it's a measure of connectivity. So if you look at simple networks or trees, they often have a beta value below 1. A network headed with this one single cycle has a beta value of about 1. And anything more complex becomes greater, but that it can really go up to a very high number. So to standardize that, you can also then calculate the gamma index, which is the ratio between the linkages or the edges and the maximum edges that could be theoretically allowed in that network. And that ranges then between 0 and 1. And it's a bit better to use to compare between the different case studies. So a common index for food web stability is the mean total degree. So the average number of links per node. However, of course, I cannot weight it here. So the assumption was more that if there's a high mean degree, if a node is linked to many others, there is a high potential, or there's a potential for a higher vulnerability for that ecosystem component, which is then maybe less manageable. I think, and also high connectivity means also higher chances of cumulative impacts that are difficult to estimate. Then I also calculated the mean degrees at every level and an assortativity index, which ranges from -1 to +1. If it's positive, the value, then nodes of a similar degree connect to other nodes with a similar degree. So it's kind of very symmetrical, or negative values mean that large degree nodes tend to attach to low degree nodes. Okay, so a quite short summary of the report. You know well that you had 18 sectors to choose from to build your linkages, and half of them occurred across all case studies. So aggregates, coastal infrastructure, fishing, harvesting, collecting, military research, shipping, tourism, or recreation and wastewater. Similar is it also with the pressures. Half of them were occurred across all of those case studies here, like abrasion, bycatch, contaminants, and so on. In terms of the ecological characteristics, here it is so that almost all components occurred in all case studies. Components like mangroves or seagrass, for example, they didn't occur in all of them. They're more kind of related to tropical areas. So when building a complete Atlantic-wide network structure, so identifying every potential linkage that exists in the different case studies, now they are weighted along by the occurrence number across case studies. So it can be a value from 1 to 7. I have also this one here, which is a bit easier than to see. So you see everything is highly connected. Of course, it's also, if you do this across different systems and you put it all together. What I mainly want to highlight now is if you look at the size of the boxes, here the green ones, that represents the number of occurrences in the case studies. And so it's kind of even across the case studies here. But for example, with the pressures in blue, there are some pressures that occur much more often, as you've seen also in the tables before, than others. And it's also similar with the sectors and also a little bit with the ecosystem services. But really the state indicators or the state components we're interested, it's kind of, they occur everywhere here. However, oops, oh no, I have to go back to the slides. So, I mean, what we are often more interested in are really the pressures that directly link to our ecological characteristics. Here again, across Atlantic, what we see is along the x-axis are the pressures, along the y-axis are the ecological characteristics. Yellow means there's no linkage, and blue means that in 7 case studies, we found the link. And so what I mainly want to highlight is that we find, let's hear, contaminants and litter occurring in, like, affecting or linking to all of those ecological characteristics. And that is really something that we see almost across all the case studies. Not in mangroves and salt marsh, because they are not existing in all case studies. A little bit similar it is with the species extraction and what is with the organic matter here. So these are pressures where it might be likely that there is a high cumulative effect also across the entire ecological components of the system. Then when looking at the most connected ecological characteristics in each of the case studies, what we found was that those 5 here had ranked like highest in almost all of the case studies. And that is the shallow sediments, shallow rock and reef, littoral sediments, littoral rock and reef. So both type of, both in the littoral and in the shallow area, and demersal fish. So because of the highly connectivity, it's also highly that they are more vulnerable just because of the cumulative effects that are often then difficult to quantify. So when it comes now to linkage change, whether there are really strong ones, it is also a bit tricky here now. So what we see is the pressures, the sectors along the x-axis, and then on the y-axis, the number of linked pressures, and the different color codes relate to the different case studies. And so what we see here mainly is that not some sectors relate only to a few, some to more, but we also see that there are differences proportionally between the case studies. But when we now, since pressures link then to the ecosystem, ecological characteristic, how is it then with the sectors linking to them? And because many pressures link to many ecological characteristics, it turns out that here, almost every sector is related to all of the ecological characteristics, and differences between case studies become smaller. And that is even stronger when doing this on the linkage from sector to the ecosystem service. That means if we want to manage the output of a specific ecosystem service, it's kind of affected or impacted by all of those sectors. That's something to have in mind, at least the way we build the networks. So can we identify key linkage chains from the presence-absence data? And I have to say, unfortunately, no, we can't. So we have 18 sectors, 19 pressures, 25 ecological characteristics, and 23 ecosystem services that you defined, which will result in theoretically almost 200,000 pathways. Out of those, almost 70,000 were realized, and about a bit more than 2,000 pathways were realized in all 7 regional networks. And that's still kind of very spread and scattered and diverse. I also tried to do some network analysis, which didn't bring new insights very much. If you do this kind of network here, this is for the Canary Current system. What it typically does, it immediately, you see the 4 different levels in the network structure, but it's not that you can see specific components highlighting out. There's another algorithm that also looks into the hub or outgoing and the authority or ingoing centrality scores. And surprise, surprise, the numbers with the most outgoing ones are all the pressures, and the ones with all the most ingoing centrality scores are all the ecological characteristics. But that's then also part of the network structure in itself. What will be more interesting to do this then on the score-based networks, which will be coming in the next steps. I tried to do this for today, but I didn't finish this. So when it comes now to looking at network indices, and the different indices here that I mentioned before, the number of components in total length and so on, that is that I did this for the entire system. And then I also did this to standardize it a little bit, also to compare. I did this also for a theoretically fully connected network and calculated the ratio. And here you see then always the number, the actual number, and then in brackets, the ratio, the theoretical one. And when I schemed through the different indices, what was sticking out a bit, that the Canary Current showed in general the highest, higher number of components with also relatively higher total length. The diversity indices were also higher in comparison to the others. Also the associativity score. And then some others like the Mid-Atlantic Ridge system was in comparison a little bit less complex and connected, but overall the values didn't change that much. And that might be also the setup of the system and kind of working together that we end up with similar networks, at least in terms of the linkages. So this is just an example of the most connected and complex system, the Canary Current. And so when we scan through here, we see that most of the pressures here really connect to almost all of the ecological characteristics in this system here, and to many of the sectors, whereas in contrast, the North Mid-Atlantic Ridge system is here sometimes less connected to the ecological components here, and to also less sectors overall, but the differences are also marginal almost. So the critical knowledge and data gaps identified were, first of all, of course, the magnitude counts and is relevant, and that is the stage 2 in work package 1, which he already did, and we've seen results from David. However, what we also haven't anticipated yet or haven't accounted for is that the strength of these links might change over time. That's something to discuss. There might be also interactions between multiple pressures and cumulative impacts that are needed and should be better estimated. Extreme events, individual hazards pose also an increasing risk in the system. And there was also the discussion that maybe some pressure components might also need further specification, that fishing should be maybe divided into sustainable and unsustainable fishing practices. Contaminants might differ also across case studies. So this was something that came out from that first initial analysis. Just a quick outlook into the next one, because if you think about when we want to revisit the loop, is that the risk assessment being done here is kind of following an ecosystems assessment that is based on indicators. And so far the risk assessment wasn't really done on indicators. And so that was then the next step, something to do. So those kind of status assessment is done here for the Baltic Sea by HELCOM, where we have different indicators in different regions, and then it says, okay, if it's above a certain threshold or target, it's green, it's in good state. Red means it's below that value, it's in bad state, or it's not assessed in white. And the question is, from here, knowing that the risk, that the status is bad or good, how likely is it under the given climate and management scenarios? What's the risk to remain in the bad state, or what's the risk to move from the good to a bad state? So I ultimately want something like this for all different indicators, some kind of evaluation, yes, it's likely or it's not likely to deteriorate further, and then maybe even by a number of experts to also say something about the uncertainty. And so the problem often when we look at semi-quantitative risk assessments, and particularly the vulnerability assessments, that they are species-based, but all the indicators, often composite indicators, where it's difficult to look at traits. So maybe there's little information, but we do have time series, what to do then? And how do we do about uncertainty, and what do we do with direct and indirect or cumulative effects? And so Helene Gutte, who's now a PhD, she worked on a modular framework in her master thesis. And now for the first paper in her PhD, she will revise it and also implement it into an R package, which will then be the basis for the first paper. And once that is done, we would like to do some kind of cross comparison with your indicator, time series, and applying that framework. And so it's kind of a bit like following more the vulnerability assessment approach, but doing this either score-based, which is typically done, but also allow for a time series-based approach, doing some estimating the exposure and the sensitivity, but also allow for a scoring which is not trait-based, but kind of more general. And once the vulnerability is defined, define the status, whether it's above a specific threshold or not, and then the risk to move into a good or bad state. And that is done then on an individual indicator, but they can be then also integrated to estimate the multi-pressure risk, multi-indicator risk, and the entire ecosystem risk, and then visualize that. So that's kind of the plan for the package. With that, I'd like to thank you for listening and can take your questions.
Excellent. Thank you for that really thorough overview, Saskia.
Good in time. Okay.
Yeah. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to quickly introduce the remaining panelists, and then the panelists are going to give you an overview of the case studies for which they're responsible and where a lot of the data for these assessments has come from. And following those presentations, then we're going to open up for questions for the whole panel, and that can be Saskia or the case study leads. So our panelists today are Lynne Shannon from the University of Cape Town, who is responsible for the Southern Benguela current case study, Benjamin Planque, who is from IMR in Norway, responsible for the Norwegian Sea case study, David Reid from Marine Institute Ireland from the Celtic Sea case study, Marcus Llope from the Spanish Oceanography Institute, who is responsible for the Canary Current System case study. We have Mari Gasalla from the University of Sao Paulo, who is responsible for the Southern Mid-Atlantic Ridge case study. Inês Gomes is here today from IMAR in Portugal, representing the North Mid-Atlantic Ridge case study, and Marinez Scherer from the Federal University of Santa Catarina, who is responsible for our Southern Brazilian Shelf case study. And so we're going to follow the sun today, and we're going to go from east to west. And to begin with, we have a pre-recorded presentation from Lynne Shannon, which is going to be presented here by my colleague, Maria.
I'm going to give you a very quick overview of some of the key results out of our initial scoring process undertaken in the South African case study using the ODIM approach to integrated ecosystem assessment. If you look at the map on the top right there, you'll see that we've really expanded the Southern Benguela ecosystem to cover our entire coast, and this is to align with the National Biodiversity Assessment. We've identified 17 sectors, 17 key pressures, and 23 key ecosystem characteristics, and these all link to the 23 ecosystem goods and services. The marine ecosystem, the marine sectors in our ecosystem that showed the greatest proportional connectance and that covered 30% of our total linkage pathways were fishing, oil and gas, which are non-renewable resources, and shipping. And the sector which had the highest impact risk and ranked the highest in terms of impact was the fishing sector. Coastal sectors also ranked fairly highly, and those included the agriculture, coastal infrastructure, wastewater, and harvesting collecting sectors. And in addition to this, our mining, both aggregates as well as our oil and gas, also ranked relatively high. In terms of our marine pressures, the top three in terms of connectance were contaminants, noise, and abrasion. You can see that in the bottom graph on the left of the panels. And in terms of impact risk, impact risk and rank, fishing-related pressures that included bycatch, abrasion, and species extraction, in particular species extraction, were our dominant marine pressures. Looking at our marine ecological characteristics, the habitats that were most connected were those closest to the shore, and those included the shallow sediment and shallow rock and reef, as well as littoral sediment and littoral rock and reef. And in terms of taxa, demersal and pelagic fish and elasmobranchs were highly connected. In terms of ranking, if you look at the right of the bottom set of graphs, you'll see that the ranking was not that different across all of our different ecological characteristics. So that was just a little overview of where we are at the moment, and thank you so much for listening.
Okay, cool. Thank you for being so prepared and having that ready for us. It was a great overview of the extended southern Benguela system. Now we're going to jump all the way up to the north because we're following the sun, and we're going to Benjamin Planque to present the Norwegian Sea case study.
Sorry, I was just struggling to find the unmute button. So this is the Norwegian Sea case study. The Norwegian Sea is, so it's a regional sea to the north, as you see on the map here, and it's mostly a temperate area, except to the north where it receives water from the Arctic. It's about 1 million kilometers square in area. And as you can see, it covers both shelves and slopes, deep basins, and also the ridge, the mid-Atlantic ridge. In terms of management and research, we have a relatively particular structure in Norway that is quite specific. And that is that we have, for more than 10 years now, we've had an established cross-sectoral management plan for the Norwegian Sea. We also have similar plans for the Barents Sea and the North Sea Norwegian sectors that you see on this map. And in these management plans, we have two advisory groups, and one of them is a scientific advisory group. And we could use this scientific advisory group in our work in Mission Atlantic to communicate and to present the results of our analysis. One important thing in this management plan for the Norwegian Sea is that the region considered in these case studies stops a little bit off the coastline. We're actually 1 nautical mile off the baseline, which means that all the processes and activities that are related to coast and fjords are not important in our area. We mostly focus on the offshore processes, and you will see this has an impact on the results we have for this case study. And another thing you can also see on this map is that the geographical component is quite important in these management plans. And this group has a focus on defining ecologically and biologically significant areas. You can see them, these green areas on the map, and you can see that some of them are related to the shelves, some to the slope, some to the deep basin, these ones, for example, and some to the ridge. So we have a collection of areas of particular importance for the management plan. In terms of results of the risk mapping for this system, when it comes to sectors, fishing is overwhelmingly dominant in this region. Fishing alone is more than all the other activities taken together in terms of risk impact assessment. And of course, the pressures are really related to fishing. We have species extraction, bycatch, and abrasion coming as the top ones. In terms of ecological component, it's much more diversified, but we still find the key exploited fish groups as the top one in terms of risk, which is demersal fish, pelagic fish, and the communities on shelf and rock reefs. An interesting aspect of this analysis is also the classification of the quality of the knowledge that's behind this mapping. I'd like to bring your attention to, for example, the comparison between contaminants and noise. In terms of risk, we have identified a lower total risk associated with contaminants than with noise, but we have a much more secure knowledge on the effect of contaminants than we have on noise. So noise in our case is a pressure that is potentially high in risk, but is still relatively uncertain in our knowledge. So I'll leave it to there for the Norwegian Sea now. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Benjamin. And now we are going to head a little bit further south, not such a big jump this time. We are coming down to the Celtic. We're going to go to the Canary Current system with Marcus Llope. Marcus, are you ready?
Sorry, I'm trying to share my screen. Let me see if I manage. Here. I cannot do it. Can you do it for me, Elliot? I will need to sign out again to share. Yeah, sorry about that. So my name is Marcos Llope, and I've done this work in collaboration with several other colleagues from my institute, mainly Eduardo, Eva, and Alfredo. So next, please. So this is the case study boundaries. It corresponds to the EEZ of 7 West African countries, going from Morocco in the north all the way down to Guinea-Bissau, including the archipelagos of the Canary Islands and Cabo Verde. Next, please. So this is a very diverse case study, not only in terms of cultures and languages, but also in degree of development of different countries. And it's an upwelling system. And you can see the thermal imprint on the pattern of the surface temperature on the right. Next, please. So as with the other case study, and we have seen this plot several times already, we carried out an IEA. And these are the sectors, pressures, and ecological characteristics. You can play with those plots in the links provided. And next, please. We have also produced the Sankey in the form of Sankey diagrams. Next, please. So if we focus on the 5 top sectors, we have fishing, shipping, agriculture, coastal infrastructure, and aggregates. Next, please. So fishing ranked first, and this is no surprise because it's one of the most productive regions in the planet. Next, please. And apart from national and local fisheries, the European Union is fishing in all the countries of the Canary Current case study. And we know also that China and Russia has bilateral agreements with them as well. And in the next slide is an example of 2 global fishing organizations that carry out part of their activity in this region. Shipping was another important sector, and you can see that there are 2 main routes from Europe to South America and from Europe to Africa that overlap with the case study. Next. And in terms of pressures, these pictures illustrate ship's graveyard in Mauritania, and also the port of Gran Canaria in the Canary Islands, which is an important hub in the region. Then we have agriculture that affects the marine environment, and this is mainly due to pool waste and sewage management. Coastal infrastructure was another important sector, And you can see here also a couple of pictures illustrating the Cansado port in Mauritania, which is used for the mining industry, and also erosion in a tourist resort in the Gambia. And aggregates is an important sector because most of our sand is being extracted for construction, in part for urban development and also tourist resorts. And you can see also as well one of the consequences in the city of St. Louis in Senegal, which is being affected by erosion and floods. And also in terms of emerging sectors, we have identified renewables. There are plans in the Canaries to build wind farms, and also the controversial oil and gas project of Tortue Admejin of Mauritania and Senegal. Then pressures, we have litter, contaminants. You can sweep the slides quickly, it's only pictures, bycatch, sealing, and species extraction. So they come from different sources and different sectors. But apart from the human pressures, we have also environmental drivers, and we are looking into seasonal and long-term changes in the upwelling, which is one of the main enrichment processes here. Next, please. And also dust deposition together with riverine inputs are another source of enrichment in the Canary Current. And all this produces the high productivity and the catches that are very important in this case study. And that was my last slide.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And smooth recovery, even though you had to rely on my clicking. Hope I kept up well enough. So now we're going to jump out into the middle of the ocean, and we have the Southern Mid-Atlantic Ridge case study, which is going to be presented by Mari Gasalla. So Mari, when you have the chance.
I'm also trying, hi everyone, I'm also trying to share my screen, but it should be a problem. So maybe if you can do this for me, Elliot, I think it would be great because
Sure thing, I'll just bring those up.
okay, thank you. Okay, I think that now I can do it. Yes? Is it okay?
Yes, if you can do it, you go.
Okay. Are you listening okay? Okay, yeah. So yes, we are moving down south. We are at the South Mid-Atlantic Ridge now. We are in the South Atlantic, and this is the area where we are studying. So the area is more on the equatorial and tropical band of the South Atlantic, and it covers 3 main islands of the mid-ridge, which are the archipelagos St. Peter and St. Paul, the Ascension Island and St. Helena Island. So we are looking at the 3 EEZ, and also the areas beyond national jurisdictions among the 3 islands. And this is a very interesting case study because we are looking at connectivity patterns between the islands and also ocean processes. And also we conducted this analysis that the other case studies are also doing. So here are some pictures of the St. Paul St. Roques archipelago. This is from Brazil. It's a mostly military station. And here the Ascension Island and St. Helena, where the population is higher than in the other islands. And here are the sectors, pressures, and ecosystem components. We found 12 sectors and 15 key pressures and 23 ecosystem components. Some of the sectors are not existing in the area, such as aquaculture, agriculture, and nuclear energy. And fishing was ranked, was more connected to the pressures and the ecosystem components, and also shipping and also wastewater from the islands. So these are the sectors that are most connected. Here is proportional connections. So these are the sectors that have more links with the pressures and the ecosystem components. So fishing, tourism, recreation, and shipping ranked the higher. And in terms of impact risk, we found also fishing, shipping, and wastewater. In terms of the pressures, we found litter and noise as most connected from the other ecosystem components and pressures. And so in terms of risk, we found litter, noise, and also organic matter. In terms of the ecosystem components, the most linked ones, more connected with the others, were shallow sediment, shallow rock and reef, pelagic fish, and littoral rock and reef. And in terms of the impact risks, we found demersal fish, demersal elasmobranchs, and pelagic fish ranking the higher risks. And in terms of the knowledge quality, as asked yesterday in the plenary, we have this. We know more on the sectors that ranked the most, and also, for instance, we know more on fishing and fish than, for instance, on thermal and salinity regimes, or also on dredging activities, for example. But this is interesting because there are points that probably we need more knowledge to put clear evidences on that. But for the main sectors, we have this regional evidence from the literature. And also we have this stakeholders engagement. So we met with experts with Santa Helena and Ascension Islands. Our group in Brazil has about 10 people working in this scoring exercise, but also we met with experts from the other islands, and also we had this very interesting stakeholders workshop when we had experts on the islands, managers, scientists, and also people experts on high seas. We have management authorities. All our invitees attended. Just I think that two of them haven't, but it was very active and interesting, and we counted with experts' opinion, polling exercises. We had received comments on methodology, management objective, things like the MPAs and areas beyond national jurisdictions. And people found very novel, interesting, and even surprised our case study. They showed willingness to engage in the next workshops and survey that we will conduct. This was the agenda of the event. And the emerging issues were mostly telecommunication cables coming in Ascension Islands, tourism intensification, some pandemics, and comments on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction challenges and need of regional management organization, and also the UN Oceans Decade opportunities were mentioned. So I think that's all. Thanks very much for your attention, and please contact us if you have any doubts. Yes.
Excellent. Thank you, Mari. And now we're going to stick with the oceanic theme, and we're going to head to the Northern Mid-Atlantic Ridge case study, which is going to be presented by Inês Gomes. So yes, thank you, Inês, whenever you're ready.
Hello from the Azores. Can you see my full screen presenting mode?
Not presenting mode.
Not presenting mode. Okay, now?
Perfect.
Okay. So hello from the mid-ocean, North Atlantic Ridge. Unfortunately, Pedro had to leave, so I'll do my best to do this presentation on behalf of him. In the North Atlantic, Mid-Atlantic Ridge, we are working mainly for people, Pedro, myself, Christopher, and Diana. So I'll present the main results so far. Our case study is represented by the EEZ, Azores EEZ, which lies within an open ocean system. The average depth is around 3,000 meters, and there is only about 10% of the area which is shallower than 1,500 meters. So we're lying in the mid-ocean. And we do have these Atlantic basin wide-scale sectors and pressures. This is an important hotspot for migratory pelagic megafauna, namely reptiles, seabirds, marine mammals, and that's on the open ocean, on the water column. But also we have lots of studies pointing out that we have a very rich, vulnerable marine ecosystem index on the deep sea area. Lying in the mid-ocean, we also have these high pressures from fishing and shipping. And in terms of regional sectors, we're basically and historically linked to agriculture and small-scale fisheries, although in the past years, we are seeing a very, very big increase in tourism, which is expected to even rise in the upcoming years. This also has a lot of consequences in terms of pressures. These images are just about 100 meters from where we work from. We have this bay. We suffer from a lot of microliter pressures, which comes from all over, but mainly from the Caribbean area and North Atlantic and Northwest Atlantic. And also contaminants from inland, from offshore areas, and from a lot of sectors. And we have very, very big increasing problems with invasive species. This picture is actually from this summer. We have a new species that just arrived, which is taking over the rocky reef macroalgae coverage. So our orendograms looks like this. It seems that it's one of the less connected systems, which mainly has to do with this open ocean system and the absence of, for example, land-based industry or marine renewable energy in the area. When we look at our sectors, we looked upon 12 sectors, and the main risks were associated with fishing, tourism and recreation, and shipping. With also some emergent sectors coming out, such as research, military, and harvesting. When we look on the pressures, on the sectors, there were 17 sectors, and species extraction and bycatch came as the big ones, and that has to do, of course, with the fishery pressure on the area. But also contaminants, litter, and invasive species seem to have a lot of risk on the area. We did add 2 pressures here on the main Mission Atlantic framework, which was light disturbance, light pollution and disturbance, and disturbance came out as quite emergent pressure also. When we look at the ecological components, again, it has a lot to do with the fisheries and the species extraction and bycatch. So we have the demersal fish as the main ecological component threatened, but also demersal and pelagic elasmobranchs and some littoral and shallow rock and reef areas. One of the things that this framework allowed us to do was also to do a lot of bibliographic review in terms of what information is available for the region and compare it to the risk that we were analyzing. So if we look at the marine megafauna here, we can see that not only there's a lot of, the risk is high for some pressures like litter, bycatch, and invasive species on the left, but also that we have different colors here. So the colors mean the amount of information we have available. there are lots of regional studies and even monitoring programs on these high risk pressures, but there are also lots of pressures that come out as quite impacting, but we only have information either by experts knowledge or global studies, so not regional studies. So this was important also to highlight in our analysis and also for management purpose. So that's it for the North Atlantic, Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Thank you.
A great overview. Thank you, Inês. And thank you for stepping in last minute. So now we're heading back to the continental shelf, and we're going to hear from Marinez Scherer from the Federal University of Santa Catarina on the South Brazilian shelf case study.
Thank you. I will share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes, not in presenting mode.
Okay. Hold on a sec. Now, so we'll talk about the South Brazilian shelf. We also have a big team working with us, and we are two coordinators of this case study. That's myself and Mari Gasalla from University of São Paulo. So that's our study area that runs from Cabo Frio in Rio de Janeiro in the north to the end of Brazil on the south, close to the border, on the border of Uruguay. So the methodology of analysis of the risks and impacts we did through a lot of meetings, and normally we have from up to 20 researchers working and discussing in these meetings from our three institutions that are part of this of the study in Brazil. That's my university, University of São Paulo, and IAPM from Defense Ministry. Here is the results of the linkage that we have among sectors, pressures, and ecological characteristics. You can see that fishing has a big role on the pressures in our ecosystems. Here we have the confidence and the impact risk for the different pressures over the ecological characteristics, and we have these squares. The bigger is the square, the bigger or the more important is the risk, and if the square is blue, it's the better confidence that we have. So we can see that the bigger squares, they do have a lot of confidence in our literature review. So we are kind of confident in our findings. And the main sectors that are impacting our ecological characteristics are, in terms of the most impacting for the less impacting, the five first ones. That's fishing, wastewater treatment, or the lack of wastewater treatment actually, land-based industry, coastal infrastructure, and tourism. And the main pressures are litter, species extraction, incidental loss of species, introduction of contaminating compounds, introduction of organic matter. We did this stakeholders engagement meeting, and we had 40 people on that. That was 28 invitees and 12 team members. We validate our results, so the invitees, they did agree with our results most of the time, and they are interested in follow-up with other meetings and follow up our work. So probably we have another sessions or occasions that we engage then in our discussions. And the main emerging issues that we got from this the discussion with the stakeholders is we do need in Brazil a marine special planning in order to plan and to manage the different use in our marine area. We noticed, and that it was pointed out that there is an increase in boat-based tourism and MPA visitation. So that's one thing that has to be organized as well. In terms of land-sea interaction, it was pointed out that we need to monitor our erosion rates in our coastal areas, and we definitely miss fishing stock assessment. So we need to monitor it, otherwise we don't know really what's going on in our fishing industry. So that's one of the main issues in Brazil in order to have a better management. And I think that's it. So thank you. And here's our contact details. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Marinez. And now our sun is taking a strange trek across the skies today, and we're heading back up to the Celtic Sea, which is going to be introduced by David Reid from Marine Institute Ireland. So, Dave, when you're ready.
Can you see that?
Yes, it's not in presentation mode, but we can see you editing.
Okay. Oh, I've got the wrong presentation, excuse me. No, I'm struggling. Oh, there it is. Can you
Perfect.
see it now?
Excellent.
All right, apologies for that. Yeah, the reason we don't go east and west and finish on the Celtic Sea is because I hadn't done a presentation at the start of the session, so I apologize. So this is a wee bit rushed. So this is the Celtic Sea case study. Most of the work has been done by Debbi. That's why I've put myself as second author on this. And this is what we've called the Celtic Sea. The Celtic Sea is often many people have very different views of what the Celtic Sea is, but this is the one that we share with the Strath E2E modelling exercise. So we've got numbers and models available to us. It basically goes up. It's the sea south of Ireland and then west of Ireland, and that's what we're going to be talking about. So it's not a hugely diverse area. It's made up mostly of shelf waters, with the shelf edge there on the western side where things change, but we're focusing mainly on the shelf waters. I'm just going to give you a quick look at the sort of outcomes of our ODIM analysis. And so on the left, you've got the linkages between with the sectors showing which sectors have the highest linkage, and on the right here you have the ranked risk of the ranked summed risk. And so as with almost every other example, fishing is A, most connected, and B, represents the highest risk. The other sectors that were important in our areas with a reasonably high risk were land-based industry and wastewater. So what this represents are out of, the fishing is in the case study area, in the case study seas, and the main other risks are coming from outside, if you like, but from the land. And you can run down through these and see other sectors which have high connectance. So we'll move on to the pressures now. So the key pressures that come out of the system are most notably those that are linked with fishing. So bycatch and species extraction came out as the most critically important factors, and then followed up by things like incidental loss, which is also a fishing related impact, and litter, which is also a fishing impact, and abrasion, also a fishing impact. So what you've got are, when we looked at the top scoring pressures, what we found was that the bulk of them linked to fishing, but then there were other sectors which came in and contributed here as well. So all these are not uniquely from fishing, but all these top pressures are pressures that fishing contribute to. I'll move on to the next one, which is the ecological components. Things are not so clear here. You can see some evidence of things like the shallow sediments, the shallow rock reef, and the shallow mud are the main components that are impacted but are at risk in our system. But in fact, there's quite a lot of things that are important. The sediment rock reef into the deeper part of the Celtic Sea is also critically or seriously at risk. And in fact, some of the fish groups are also at risk. So as I said, this was very hurried, but we also carried out an extensive stakeholder review with a group of stakeholders from a number of countries, because we have that the players in the Celtic Sea include people from Britain, people from France, and people from Belgium. And so we had a pretty good stakeholder review with those guys. There was about somewhere about 25, I can't remember exactly, people who were very engaged with it. It had that same characteristic as others have. Part of it was validation. Are we doing this right? Do you want to add more things? What we found from the stakeholders was they did want to add more things, particularly in terms of sectors or activities, but that we'd actually encompassed those already in what we'd done, and we could explain that out. I think the most important things that came out from the stakeholder review was that they were very interested in multi-sector interaction. So where you're not just looking at what one sector does, but you're looking at multiples together. And the one that came through most strongly from that was the interaction between fishing, good, because that's what we do, offshore renewable energy, and the creation of marine protected areas under the 30% protection by 2030. And the other thing, and I guess this will be true right across the board, is that climate change was brought up a lot by the stakeholders. And of course, at this point, we're doing a nowcast in all these ODEM studies. So we're going to look at climate change then as the driver, if you like, for projecting all these results forward. So which aspects of climate change would likely make these rankings change. So I apologize for the rushedness of this, and I apologize for going last, and yeah, I just apologize. So that's me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dave. That was a really good overview. And one thing I've noticed across all of the case studies is the repetition, and this has been brought up in our main session as well, of fishing being the key impact and selective species extraction recurring across all case studies. And also just then in the last two presentations where we have almost polar opposites across the Atlantic Basin, the South Brazilian Shelf and the Celtic Seas case study, both talking about the concern of the stakeholders with the interactions between what is kind of the more traditional industry of fishing and newer ones such as wind and more tourism operators. But we're not here to think about what I find interesting. So now I'd like to invite everyone to the Q&A box, or you can raise your hand as an attendee to ask questions. We already have one question answered and one unanswered. So to kick things off, I'd like to invite Patrizio to ask your question of Benjamin live in the chat.
Yes. Well, thanks everyone for all these very interesting presentations about the specific issues in the different case studies. The one, I have basic question for everyone, but the one for the Norwegian Sea. So you mentioned, Ben, the case study region is away from the coastal part, and basically meaning away from fjords or outside the fjords. I was wondering if there is a way to account for some of these pressures that are occurring in, or some of the sectors that are producing pressures in the fjords might have long-range effects also in open ocean areas. Maybe not all the way to the 1 million kilometers squared that you showed, but is there any way to account for this type of connectivity between coastal processes and the effects and open ocean regions?
Yeah, we did that in a way in our case study. So if you take, for example, agriculture and coastal infrastructure, these can have impacts in terms of contaminants that go beyond the coastal zone that we exclude, so that can actually enter our case study area. But the impact of aquaculture, for example, in our case study is minimal, because aquaculture has a very local impact in the fjords, which can be very important in the fjords, but it doesn't extend into our case study area. So I think in contrast with quite a number of the other case studies, because we have that line that is 1 nautical mile off the baseline, we have actually excluded a lot of activities, sectors that, like tourism, is very minimal in our case study. Not because it doesn't happen, it's increasing like everywhere else. It's increasing in Norway, but it often doesn't go that far. Tourism is in the fjords and a little bit off the fjords to do whale watching and other things, but it doesn't really go into our case study area. So when the impact goes beyond the coastal zone and into our case study area, we have tried to account for it, but most of the time it doesn't, or it's very minimal.
Okay, I don't know if it's a good example, but cod, I know that they are using the fjords for spawning, and then they migrate outside, right? So in that case, it's kind of living between the two regions.
Yes, so that is always a problem. I mean, no region is isolated from the rest. So of course, we have a lot of migrating species in that area, either doing reproductive migration or feeding migrations. So I think we looked at the major impacts for the activities that occurred either within the region or that could impact the stock. But here, again, for cod, how to say that, it's not a major impact on the cod stock from the coastal activities, except the coastal fishing, but that's already accounted for.
Yeah.
Cool, thanks for that. And now we have a question from Martin Linderen from the audience.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
So thanks a lot for a great presentation. First of all, Saskia, the great overview, and also the individual presentation. So my question is more broadly, across all these case study areas, and I noted that looking at all the differences in the network structure and the complexity of the resulting risk scores and so on, links, and also the what is considered to be a key component or a key stressor across these areas. It would be really interesting to know to what degree these both the complexity but also the risk scores are conditioned on the people that are involved in the actual scoring and setting up these links across the different areas. So for instance, what is the diversity of expertise, both among the scientists, but also among all the stakeholder groups? Because that can significantly bias the interpretation of what is important and not. And just from a previous small case study we had in the Baltic Sea, just among the scientists, we had noted that it's extremely varied, your perception of the system, and it's so biased by your own perception of your own field of research, for instance. So I think what could be really interesting is to derive some overall metrics about who are involved in each case study, how many people, what are their expertise, what is hot considering now, for instance, litter, and see whether some of these metadata can explain the differences in network structure and scores across case study areas. So you could use the networks indicators, Saskia, that you calculated, but then you could look at what can explain the variation in that across case studies based on some metrics about attendance and profession and sectors involved. So that was my question.
It was quite a long and detailed question, Martin.
Yeah.
Did you have someone in particular you would like to
ask
about their specific workshop?
I guess the one to answer first of all, I guess, would be Saskia, but also for the other ones to chip in.
Okay. Well, in the analysis, I didn't account for any of that because I had only one answer for each case study, and that, of course, is often then challenging to make any estimate of uncertainties. I don't know if you recall from the figure that I showed, like where we eventually would like to get when this new PNAS paper, where you have the indicator and then the risk for each indicator, but on the y-axis from all the cumulative risk and then from all the different experts. And so I think they really did like asked 80 or 100 experts. And so that is one way, of course, to include also the uncertainty by doing that for several people. Maybe it would be interesting to see whether to kind of do this within each case study by asking stakeholders, or do this several times and do the scoring part. To get some kind of estimate. What we will plan to do is when we do the semi-quantitative indicator-based risk assessment with Helena in her PhD, that she will then ask the case study leaders, but also the different other case study researchers that are involved, to get several answers and also use that in addition to some data to estimate some level. But I mean, we should ask the other case study leaders.
Yeah, we can go to them now. So Lynne, you would like to respond?
Yes, thank you. What I did want to say is that in the South African case study, we are really, really lucky because we've undergone a national biodiversity assessment undertaken by SANBI. And during that process, diverse stakeholders were engaged, and their expertise was brought in. So we have all of that. So although the initial scoring was undertaken by our small team, we had the influence and the inputs previously that we could capture within our assessments. So we were fortunate there. And then one other little point, just I think the confidence levels associated with our different scorings, I think that really helps to capture a little bit of that. So we could maybe think of bringing that in a smart way to your analysis, Saskia, as we go forward. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that was a somewhat novel approach, or it was at least developed further in this last round. So I think it would be great to work on that more. We have Dave wanting to comment as well.
Yeah, so I think the key thing I would say that, I mean, Martin's right, of course, that you know, I've said this in so many meetings, you put 10 scientists in a room and you'll get 15 opinions.
Yes.
And so the issue is not so much, yeah, I don't think you're ever going to be able to get a provably unbiased response to things. You know, there was one guy in our fairly large group of experts who just spent the whole time going on about sea pens because that was what he was interested in, and so you do get an element of that. But I think the thing to remember here is that this is a screen. This is a first level scoping exercise. I think you would not be planning to create policy on the basis of this. You use this to focus down on the things that at least in a consensual, if not unbiased group, came through as the most important variables. And part of the thing that gives you reassurance of that is that it's very consistent. You know, fishing is the major influence in most places, and that when we went to a completely different set of experts, the stakeholders, they came back with, yeah, that sort of makes sense. You know, that sanity check thing. So no, it's not perfect, but then your first level scoping isn't going to be perfect. It's when we get up to your level of work, Martin, that we get perfect.
Sounds like a challenge. Nice challenge, Dave. So we'll move on to Benjamin. You have a question, response.
Yes, I think I'll follow up on the lines opened by Lynne and Dave. In the Norwegian Sea, it's a bit the same. We have already a framework with quite a diversity of people who have interacted over a long period of time and in an iterative manner. And we did a quality or sanity check with the stakeholders afterwards. So I think even though it's not unbiased, it's fairly robust. But one thing that is interesting, I think, is that this framework, this risk assessment framework that we use is quite constrained in a way, because you go from your sectors to your activities and your ecosystem components. And in other exercises where we didn't bring in that kind of framework, then you can actually have representations of the system that are quite different depending on the stakeholders you're talking to. And you also get a lot of information about feedbacks in the system, which we can't get in the type of analysis that we've done. So I think that's also there are different ways of extracting information from the stakeholders. And but within that framework, I think we were quite robust in a way.
Yeah, it's always good to be reflective of what we're imposing on these things. So it's a good take. Marcos?
Yeah, I wanted to share my experience as well when carrying out this exercise. And it's interesting because what we, for instance, found is we asked during the validation exercise, we asked the experts to rank the main sectors they thought they were important. And for instance, for the fishing experts, they didn't find, or they didn't think, some of them, that fishing was the most one of the most important sectors. So, and if you ask twice, they may change their opinion as well. And another experience I wanted to share with you is when we carried out this exercise within ICES for the Bay of Biscay and Iberian coast, so a different ecoregion, but we were different experts in the room, and some of them didn't find very comfortable when scoring sectors or pressures that they didn't know much about. But when they were experts on the component or the pressure, for instance, seabirds, then they didn't have an opinion either easily, because they were thinking, yes, this species is affected by a catch, for instance, but this other species is not so much affected. So it's always difficult.
Yes, and some interesting feedback on the different perceptions of interactions with stakeholders as well. So I have a couple of hands up here, and I just want to check, Marinez, is yours a follow-up to this, or is it a new question?
No, it's a kind of follow-up to this.
Yeah, would you like to follow up then?
Okay. No, just grabbing a bit of comments here and there, and I think I agree with all of them. And having a methodology, we all follow the same methodology, it's kind of, we can compare the results. It will always be biased, doesn't matter what we do. But this step of validating the stakeholders, we did something similar to Marcos. We asked them before showing our results which sectors they thought would be the most important in terms of pressures, and kind of it was the same one that we had in our results. So it's validating stakeholders. This step is really important for this methodology, I think. And so we all did that. And I don't think that we found really different things. I don't know, at least in our case in Brazil, we didn't. So I think it is a good methodology as long as we all follow the same thing.
Yeah, and we have Debbi agreeing completely and saying they followed the same step in the Celtic Sea, but maybe Dave can add to that as well.
I was going to go a wee bit. I was going to go very specific when we took the fishing part of the ODEM to a whole group of fishermen who we'd managed to capture in a room one day, and their initial reaction was somewhat similar to Marcos's, that fishing wasn't that bad. And when you started to go through it with them, they steadily found themselves marking it up worse than they'd actually thought at the beginning. Because it took a while to get into the methodology, but once they got there, they sort of said, yeah, okay, we're not great. And that was really interesting from them. The other thing I think is that I think Ben's right. It's a very constrained framework, but I think it really isn't the whole process here that we're looking at. It's a step on the road. One of the things that we found in a lot of our expert stuff was that people really wanted to start looking at what I would call second order relationships. If I fish on this, then it stops that happening, then that causes this. And if you start doing that, it becomes instantly very, very complex. And so we had to, I think exerting these artificial walls on what you're doing is both constraining but liberating, because it means you get a result which you can then start to burrow in and do these additional pieces of work on second order or multiple effects. You do those at the next stage, the semi-quantitative stage. That was what I hoped to do anyway.
And sensible. Inês?
Yes, just sharing our experience also. We also have the feeling that the stakeholder validation phase was actually more coherent or easier than the expert panel as expected. But one thing that helped in the experts panel judgments, what we've done is we divided the expert panels according to ecological characteristics. So not according to pressure, so not experts in liter, but experts in demersal elasmo ranks. So that actually helped doing the scoring just for that ecological characteristics. And also we asked them to provide us the references. So actually the scoring was based on their opinions and the references they provided us. So when we have the confidence level of expert opinion, it's actually an opinion that the experts couldn't provide us references on. Otherwise, it was ranked as a global or a regional study or a monitoring program. So that helps us give us robustness to the study.
Great, getting some really good insight into the detail of how these data were formed and extracted. So thanks. Mari, you have a...
Yes, I just want to point out to add that in our stakeholders meeting, some interesting comments came out concerning the different evidences that we have. For instance, if we compare fishing, for instance, I mean, species extraction, and we compare with, for instance, the knowledge that we have from contaminants and organic matter, and even shipping are less documented, and we don't have too much evidences of the pressures that, for instance, the shipping industry provides in terms of persistence and also widespread in the ecosystem components. So I think that probably one commonality among all the case studies can be that we found less evidences from some pressures or some sectors than others in general, right? So just a comment.
Great.
And also about climate change, yes, just mentioning climate change, because if we put climate change in those pressures, we also can have, some widespread among the species and the ecosystem components, and also the persistent, the current time period that we are analyzing. Yeah, so I think that if we include climate change, maybe the ranking can change a little bit.
Saskia.
Yeah, when I compiled the networks for the deliverable report, I noticed something that also reminded me or touched upon something I also noticed it in another project where we did a vulnerability assessment following a specific paper, the Gasalla paper. And although there are clear instructions, we realized when doing the scoring that people still had different perceptions, and we had really tough arguments. And somehow it kind of didn't really solve it. It was at some point more like we see what the majority thinks, and the individual person just ranked differently. And I was wondering whether the same happens also maybe for the ODEM approach within the case studies, because I noticed, and I talked with Benjamin about it, for two case studies, that is the South Mid-Atlantic Ridge and the Norwegian Sea, there were pressures that were maybe only connected to a sector, but not to the ecological characteristic, or only to the ecological characteristic, but not to the sector. And so in the Norwegian Sea, for example, there were aggregates that connected to salinity and thermal regime, but salinity and thermal regimes did not connect to any ecological characteristics, whereas in the others, it connected to everything. So then I wondered whether if somebody else would have done it for the Norwegian Sea, would have they also just not made the connection, or would they have rather also said, temperature, of course, it is really important for every species, so making a link everywhere. The same was also with pH, that was like really linking to many ecological characteristics, but in the South Mid-Atlantic Ridge, we see again, it didn't connect to anything. And so my question to the case leader, like, is it, like, there might be still the danger that different perceptions of what it means to link the components, that it leads to different network structure, but it not necessarily that it's a different system. And with that respect, it's just the way how we construct the network is different.
Yeah, maybe we can go to Benjamin about the temperature in the Norwegian Sea first.
Yeah, I think it's not necessarily a question of perception of how the system functions, but it's a question of reading how the ODEM mechanics works. And we actually had discussions in our group about this, and iterative discussions. It took some time to agree, but the issue is really in ODEM to relate sectors to pressures and to response. And temperature and salinity are not varying most due to sectors. They are varying because of natural climate variability, ocean climate variability. And in that sense, the way we read the ODEM protocol, these variations should not be included, the impact of these variations, because they are not driven by the sectors. So there are slight variations that are imposed by the sectors, but it's not these variations that have consequences on the species. So that's how it was coded. But of course, it's the reading of the ODEM. So I think the training phase in the ODEM protocol and teaching phase is vital on some of these issues, because you really need the different individuals and groups to have a common understanding of what they're answering when they're scoring. Maybe Debbi will write some notes in that chat.
Maybe we can go to Mary and hear about her experience with the pH in the South Mid-Atlantic Ridge.
Yes, for us, it's very interesting that you point Norwegian and South Mid-Atlantic Ridge, because our case study is really data poor comparing to especially Norwegian Sea, and it was a learning exercise for us to conduct the approach. The ODM approach was very interesting, but when we put a link, and an important link, we need a reference to evidence that link. So all that we did in the process was really link just when we had and we found a paper or a report or something that really documented that kind of interaction. So I don't believe that it's a expert perception problem, but rather some lack of knowledge if this was certainly spread or persistent, which are categories for the ODEM methodology. So in regard to your comment, Saskia, I think that's more about material evidences of the pressures in the ecosystem characteristic in the area, rather than expert opinion. Yeah.
So my question would be, would have everybody only made the link when there is the literature, or was it sometimes so that, yeah, but we know it from other systems, so we know that it must have an effect, so I'd still make checkbox, yes, there is a linkage. It's just something that one probably has to have in mind, that sometimes systems do not differ that much, because if there's a link missing, it's not that it's in reality missing, it's what we know or think. Yeah,
it's really good to get this insight going back to the case studies, the back where the data was collected, and unraveling this across the different levels of data processing and analysis. But I know that Debbi has a really good insight across the whole methodology. So thank you for joining us, Debbi. Maybe you could respond to this.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for elevating me to speaker status. Yeah, no pressure here at all. As the person who gave the training, I hope that it was mostly clear. But what we've tried to do with this is where there has been questions, we've had one-on-one sessions with the case studies that have raised questions with us. In some cases, it might be a case that they've interpreted it in their own way by having a look at the directions, but we do have a common approach and protocol across all of the case studies that was given in common training, that has been recorded and is still available for all of the case studies, and we remain available for that as well. If there are issues where there's inconsistencies, like you point out, where there's things that aren't connected the whole way through, that is something that we should address. But it's important to note that these are initial products, not final products. The idea with the scoping is that it is supposed to be iterative. And we have spoken about the issues in relation to pH and salinity change and temperature, because they were originally included to try and capture some of these climate change aspects, which of course are really difficult to capture in a framework like this. And so in the second step, it was going, okay, these things can be included from particular pressures. And so that's what's being captured in the ODEM. So when there's temperature change, for instance, from water outfall from wastewater plants that's raising the temperature, those kinds of localized effects, or changes in salinity, again, probably from wastewater or something like that, then you take them into account through that three-stage network. When we're talking about changes in temperature and salinity and so on that affect ecological components, they are really important, but we're taking them into account in the modeling components rather than in this scoping phase. So as we've said, you know, you, Saskia, were presenting the linkages at this. We have only just completed the first round of the entire scoring assessment for all of the case studies. And at this point, we're working on drawing it together to see where there are commonalities and divergences, but also where there may be some inconsistencies that we need to address. So it's part of the work in progress, I think. And if I can add a comment to one of the conversations that were going on earlier on, I did post in the chat, but just to highlight that I think that it is really important that we continue to look at the data support side of things. It does add robustness to the expert opinions, but the idea of doing the scoping based off expert opinion is so that we can include elements for which we don't have data, that we only have expert knowledge for, because if we limit it to the components that we have strong data for, then we're only learning about the things that we've already learned about. And this is, we want to be able to flag the areas that are gaps. You know, Benjamin highlighted the noise as one in his analysis, and they are across the entire spectrum of the case studies. So I think it's really important that we do track this and that we do look where the data gaps are across the case studies and where they're different to different case studies, which I think is something Benjamin mentioned yesterday. But I don't think that it's something that should impact on how we score them. We should score them and then provide the evidence for that, but still score the parts that we have low data availability for.
Thanks, Debbi. And I see that it looks like you answered something Dave was going to address as well. So you're covering all the bases here. Thanks for that.
I just wanted to add, yeah, Debbi, of course, got all the points right. It goes without saying. I mean, the critical thing about the whole purpose of the expert judgment component was, or the whole idea of the ODEM is it's inclusive. It's everything. It's the whole ecosystem. Even if you know very little about it, you should give it a score. And then that's why we then have the knowledge basis underneath it. And that's a really, really critical part of it. What I really love about this exercise is that we've had one of the biggest expert and stakeholder linkage exercises anybody's done anywhere, I suspect, and now we're analyzing it and exploring its complexities, and it is always, as Debbi says, possible to go back and change things, change how you look at things, fix the anomalies that arise due to the fact that Debbi failed to educate people properly, and it allows us to tune the thing up, get rid of those problems, you know, go back and ask Mari to actually score something even if she doesn't know what's going on, and we can fix it. That's great. I love it.
Yeah, and I think that comes back to one of the comments that was repeated through some of the case studies, was that the engagement they had with the stakeholders was very positive, and people were looking forward to re-engaging. So that's going to be really important also for that next cycle. So yeah, Debbi.
Just another small comment that I'd thought of earlier on that I thought it would be good to share is that in one example, we did work with our RRC case studies to split fishing down into various components parts. So instead of just looking at fishing, we split it into demersal fishing, pelagic fishing, potting, and so on, and got those fisheries stakeholders that Dave had managed to trap in that room to score them. And although, you know, we've all been through this in these teams, it's a pretty long and boring exercise, they were willing to come back on a second day to finish it off. But the upshot of that was they wanted to do it because they felt that fishing was too broad a category because there are nuances between the different ones. But the outcome of it was actually there was very little difference. When we did split them out and we scored them, they were still very similar to each other, which is why in subsequent analyses we've tended to bundle them more. So sometimes you can want to split things out because it feels like it's too high level, but that's why we've maintained, you know, we have done some exercises where we've looked at it at more fine scale. The expert knowledge hasn't been there to be able to differentiate it further. So this has proved to be a functional level for being able to highlight where issues are that you can work with, and in the next steps, refine them further.
Great. So now we're going to come back to Patrizio, and perhaps for a different line of questioning, we can kick something else.
Not really. It was a question that I had like half an hour ago, but when we started the discussion. But no, I'm going back to the point raised about the robustness of the approach. And it was interesting to hear the comment that the more mature case studies, like the Celtic Sea and the Norwegian seas, they trust more, I mean, in terms of the results they get, because they have a long history of engagement with some of these stakeholders, which is actually quite interesting from a coordination point of view of the project, because it means that, I mean, this exercise has to be long lasting, even beyond the end of the project. And some of these stakeholder forums that we have organized at the regional scale, they should last longer than the life of Mission Atlantic, or maybe Mission Atlantic should last longer than the 5 years that we promised. That's the other way to see it. But it's interesting, I mean, this type of, because it is a framework that indeed is a way of condensing or assessing the level of knowledge on the specific issue. And that level of knowledge will change in an iterative way. I wonder more about, once we will start to introduce some quantitative type of assessment and indicators and analysis, how the different experts and stakeholders will react to that. I mean, they will kind of sort of get a consensus in an easier way, or actually will be more difficult to get a consensus about specific effects. And I'm asking this specifically to the ones that are more mature in terms of Celtic Sea and Norwegian seas, but also Saskia mentioned the fact that some of these analyses have been performed in the Baltic Sea. So based on their experience in that region, for example, how your scoring changed in the Baltic Sea before and after you started introducing some analysis of indicators.
Okay, so if I was, well, for the vulnerability assessment, we have now different opinions and different vulnerability scores eventually coming from each expert. And so that is then a way of also calculating a mean score and then get some uncertainty level to that. And so that is one way of doing it. What we plan to do now with Helene is, if there is also then time series data, to do exactly the same thing, but see what the data kind of, what kind of score that gives, so that you have maybe different expert opinions telling you a little bit about the variation in the final scores, and then also the data to get a better estimate of the uncertainty. And then it's like, I think maybe when having some kind of model outputs that either tell the same than the stakeholders or something opposite, it would be also nice to sit together with the stakeholders and don't say that, don't take the model output as kind of the truth, but more like that's another expert opinion. It's just differently determined, and that together can say something about the uncertainty envelope, and to use that. So I think it doesn't really contradict necessarily. It's more like it helps to see more like how narrow is our range or how wide it is. Great. Dave, you've got a response or a new question, whichever it is, take it away.
No, it's more of a response. I mean, I definitely expect that when we start to include more quantitative data, we'll change our perception to some extent. Some of it will be, you know, we will confirm where we were, some of it we expect to see change it. So I think that's important. The other thing is to remember, we can't do that to every single linkage in our system. That's why the scoping exercise was designed to narrow down those things we think are most important. I think the other thing that is important to remember as a power of the ODEM analysis is the known unknowns, if you like. Or unknown knowns. I'm not quite sure. I'm not Donald Rumsfeld, but it's to identify those things, particularly where you think there's a high risk, but you haven't got a lot of evidence for it. And so that's a really almost as important as finding out the high evidence, high risks, because you probably knew that already. But where you've got unknown high risks, that's really scary. That's the uncertain place. And so we have to think about them as well as just piling more quantitative evidence on top of those things we probably know already.
Yes, and Benjamin, you have a follow-up as well?
Yeah, I think a lot of what I wanted to say was said by Dave, but I can add that to follow from Patrizio's comment that the relationship with the stakeholders is really a long-lasting exercise. It takes time to build this, and we get educated by meeting the stakeholders, and they get educated by meeting us, and it takes time. It really, it has to go beyond the project. So it's important to have some structure that helps holding these groups communicating through time. And when it comes to data and indicators, as Dave said, so if we take the noise case, for example, in the Norwegian Sea, so this is a potentially high risk but very poorly documented area. So when we are in situations like this, there is debate and divergence on how you would rank that against other pressures like fisheries that are well documented. So what data does is that it helps getting people more in agreement. So it has a real added value. We lose some of the divergence of views when the data comes in, and that's where it becomes important. So if something is high on the agenda, at some point, opinions are not enough.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a really good concluding sentence there, Benjamin. So, Debbi, you also have a thing to follow up?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, possibly a little tangential, but in relation to this, the scoping versus indicators process, that I think sometimes we get a little bit too hung up on the Levin loop, which was the one that Saskia showed in her presentation. And the reason I think this is because the Mission Atlantic loop in our application was slightly different. And that was for a reason, because we defined it as, you know, scoping being the first step. And all of what we have been doing on this has been scoping. And the first step on the Levin loop is to define EBM goals and targets. And that's what we're doing with the stakeholder consultation. Is we've flagged where there are these huge, where we think the highest risk in the system is, what is scoping the state of the system, and then scoping with the stakeholders to define where these goals and objectives are. And from there, we focus on the indicators that are relevant to those goals and objectives and so on, rather than trying to look for indicators for everything that's in the ODEM framework. And so we take those steps, so we're refining the whole way along. And so I think that we're very much on the path rather than mixing around with it. And instead, when we get down to this analyze uncertainty and risk part of the Levin cycle, what we're talking about then is the uncertainty and risk associated with our management actions that we're looking at in our management strategy evaluations, rather than the risk that we're talking about in the scoping exercise. And so the terminology is really important because it can cause confusion, but I just thought I should, it might help to try and clarify that a little bit, which is difficult to do without pointing at the actual diagrams, but for a lot of the people that are here are familiar with the processes that we're talking about. But yeah, I don't think that we've mixed things up. I think we're just looking at it in a slightly different way.
Yes, yeah, it's nice to step back and see where we are when we put ourselves in these boxes. So that was a good suggestion to break down that loop a little bit more and have another look. So Saskia.
Yeah, okay, I want to respond to two things. One is Dave, and also one is now with what Debbi said. Coming to what Debbi just said, so I think there are two different approaches that we do within Mission Atlantic. One is really the stakeholder scoping oriented approach that you do with the ODEM part, and that is mainly done in Work Package 1. But when we look at what we want to do in Work Package 5 and 7, and when it's more related to indicators, then it might be so that it's completely off the ODEM approach and scoping loop, because it might be so that the time series you have is not really representing many of the ecological characteristics. Or many, like let's say you have many indicators that relate to one or two characteristics, and the others you don't have it. But that's kind of then what we work with. And so it could be also that the risk assessment that we do based on the indicator will tell a different story, which is fine. That's what we have to stick with. And what I wanted to say in terms of what Benjamin mentioned and Dave, what like the data that can help is when we did an exercise also linking pressures to indicators, it was easier to say, ask for direct effects. Most people felt comfortable, but when it came to indirect effects through the food web or cumulative effects, nobody really wanted to make any kind of guess. And so this is kind of, I think, where models and data comes in nicely, because if you have data, it's not the direct effect. If I look at fish distribution and temperature, that is not exactly the direct effect if I do this statistically, but that's kind of eventually what comes out is, and that's all the cumulative parts. So this is something I think is nice to complement that. And as Benjamin said, where we have little information or less knowledge, then maybe we can add that.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point that these things are definitely complementary, not contradictory. And I think it's been made and said in multiple different ways in different contexts. And I think it's very true. Lynne.
Thanks, yeah, I love cumulative effects. No, my comment's just a really small one, but just I think one of the real benefits of this whole scoping exercise and discussing with stakeholders is that it sheds light on some of the either the pressures or the actual whole linkages that we kind of all know might be important, but we maybe not so sure of it. And often then, for example, in our case, noise is something that's come up just from various discussions. And so that's really going to spur us to put some student studies onto it and to look at both research into the impacts, but also into alleviating those impacts. You know, what can we actually do management-wise and take that to our decision makers when we have further work on that. So I just really wanted to cover that from a slightly different angle as well.
Yeah, and I can second that in my small amounts of interactions with stakeholders and other projects. That it's always a great generator of ideas for further research, because there are always so many questions. Debbi.
Just to return to Saskia, I just wanted to clarify, I absolutely don't mean for ODEM to dictate everything as much as it's my gig. But no, what I meant is just in terms of in the ODEM, if we decide that looking at the chat there, telecommunication cables aren't important, then we probably won't be looking for indicators for anything related to those kind of pressures, you know, so it can help to eliminate things. Not that we would be looking at exactly the same things, but of course, as you mentioned, you know, for indicators, you're often looking at either species or how do we deal with composite indicators and so on. So I get that, don't worry.
And a quick word from Benjamin, maybe?
Yeah, just without them dictating what we should do in the rest of the project, I think it's really good in highlighting where the data match or doesn't match the key components of the system that we've identified in ODEM. And for the Norwegian Sea, which is maybe the place where there is most data, Lucy Buteschi has worked harder to extract as many as possible time series for all the different components that we've identified. And I think we can hardly match half of them. So it just shows us that maybe the knowledge and the data we have is only partially matching what we really need to do if we want to go into this beyond the scoping, but into really the information through data in the process. So I think it's really valuable to point that out. Again, yeah, it's the exercise points to where we don't know and where we don't have the information, and that's as important as just telling us what's going on, I think.
Dave, I'll give you one last quick word before we're going to have to do a roundup. You're muted, I'm afraid.
Yeah, it's great talking without a microphone. The previous example I'm most familiar with of attempting something like what we did with the ODEM was the exercise done in the North Sea, ICES WGI knows, where they did they PCA'd everything they could find, and basically what they did was they just anything they got a time series for. I mean, literally anything. And then they threw it all into a bucket and PCA'd it, and then said, well, there you go, that's what's happening. And that's sort of fine, and it's very data driven, but it gives you this very twisted perception that the only things that are important are the things you measure. And you know, what we tried to get away from in this analysis was that big trap, you know, but if you do it that way, it's incredibly normative, and at least ODEM is trying to be disruptive, which I think is quite cool.
I wholeheartedly agree, and I'm afraid, Mari, that we're going to have to wrap up here. So I'm just going to say a really big thank you to all of our panelists for taking the time to, you know, jump in the deep end and be ready to answer questions on the spot. I appreciate it. Thank you also to Martin and Debbi for jumping up into the pressure cooker up here. So it was great to have all of your insights and input. Just a note for the rest of the Mission Atlantic crew who will be joining again tomorrow morning. Double check the agenda. We have a slightly earlier starting time tomorrow, where we have input from the European Commission to squeeze in the beginning. But other than that, I've thoroughly enjoyed being a part of this conversation. So thank you all once again. And we hope to be in touch with those of you who aren't in the project in the near future. But to keep in contact, check out our website and follow us on whatever your favorite social media is. On that note, good evening.